Oh, this is what I want to talk about. This is from Big, obviously. It's on Big Tractors, Big Tractor Power. 49.94. My cousin had, what was that, Matt? 48.90? I think. We're talking from 1200s to 2470s. Matt had a 2670. Talking about rigid frame case tractors. I'm going back over here. Well, you saw in there, that was some of my manuals in the list. I used to keep them out in the shop. And then in here, Debbie gave me this nice semi-Hoosier that's an Oxford with all the space in here with a cantilever top. Well, the cantilever top's shot. But got it to open back up, and I can put my manuals in there in a beautiful spot for it. So anyway, and then I've got the table here that I can move the stuff aside and look, and the tray over there. No, it has nothing to do with case rigid frame four-wheel drives. Way back, Case tried doing something that actually made sense, but they had some major failures. One of Case's problem, well, I say major failures, actually they were minor stupid failures that became major. And I do mean stupid failures. Excuse me. The 1200s and others I'm not totally familiar with. In fact, I'm not familiar with the steering system completely, but I did run into some of them and see, and there was years ago, there were some that I repaired. Now, I sat there thinking about this, and it came to my mind when I was working at one of the shops back in the 80s, late 80s. And when I was working on a Case International planter where they decided to use a slave cylinder hydraulic setup for raising and lowering the planter. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that over here on the right was this massive cylinder that actually had somewhat of a leak in it. This is the bizarre part. I guess it had a check valve of sort in it. And over on the other side was this was the master and this was the slave. Single acting. Yeah. So you had to keep working. And I mean, I took the planter up in the air. We're almost 45 degrees and almost bending things. And he says, yeah, that's how they want to reset. Because the boss couldn't help me and there was no information. So I kept lifting and lifting and lifting and lifting and had to put oil in the tractor I was using and lifting and finally got the thing to go up and down. And it worked great in general. And like they said, if the slave cylinder setup works properly, this cylinder on the right is so large as the master because it has to have twice the surface area, at least, as the slave over here. You say, why? You're pushing in here on the base end, which is good, because all of the pressure and all of the lifting force is here on the bottom. Why? Because on the top, there has to be more than enough oil here, or about the right amount of oil, to push over into the slave cylinder. So while you're pushing up and down on this one, going up and down, you're trying to get oil to leak past the piston to go on the rod side, go from the rod side out of port over here to the slave cylinder on the other side, and get that filled up and start moving that one up and down and get all the air worked out of it. And you say, what significance is that? The significance is simple. Going to the Case rigid frame tractors. Why? Well, you have four-wheel steer on the axle. So just like, well, let me switch it over here. Whoops, that didn't work. All right, you see the front tires are turning. The frame is not. The tires are, just like a conventional modern all-wheel drive. If you look closely enough, you'll even see the rear tires coming in where they call articulating steering. But both axles, you see your planetaries and such, actually have universal joints inside them, usually CV-style joints, which means there are two U-joints in there. So if you look at the front end of your all-wheel drive tractors, your backhoe loaders and such, on the front axles, your Carreros and the ZFs, and there's another variety that's fairly decent too. But in the front, you'll see some of them only have a single joint, but most have a double U-joint that works so that they can steer the front wheels and the axle can stay rigid. This tractor has it front and rear. Well, that just seems kind of common. Well, think about it. What's your articulating tractor have? Two rigid axles, and in between are drive shafts. Two drive shafts, in fact. One for the PTO, one for the transmission. And what's on each one of them? Quite often you'll find out that there are two drive shafts to go through coming out of the transmission that's rubber mounted, so it needs to move. That will have a U-joint. a carrier bearing, a U-joint, and a drive shaft to the rear end and the back. And then above it will be a PTO with the same setup. You got a rigid frame tractor. What's that mean? You don't have either of those drive shafts. Now, you only have 3 joints on the lower drive shaft, sometimes 4, depending on the tractor and the company, for your articulating to drive the front and the rear. Well, wait a minute. That's correct. Some of you caught that, didn't you? There can be 3 universal joints going to the back, and going to the front, there's 2. So you can have 4 or 5 universal joints just to drive the axles out of the transmission. Well, what did Case do? That's gone. The tractor hooks to a transfer drive, the hooks to a transmission, and sometimes the transmission is the transfer drive. Come in straight to the tranny, drop a transfer, and go out to the axles, just like the articulating, but they don't have to articulate. The axles oscillate. Uh-oh. The kids are here. So some of the problems they had with the steering, which was a fantastic drive unit, but some of it, they had cables. And a mechanical doodad here that you could move over here for crab steering, that you could move over here for front steer. You could move the axle separately. They had so much garbage on cables on there, the cables sticking, that you lost steering. And your front was your primary and cables hooked to the rear. It was bizarre. What should they have done? They should have gone back to the slave cylinder deal, and that would have taken care of a majority of their problem. With a switching valve to switch to engage the rear to either crab steer with your slave cylinder setup and or your articulating steering, where they steer in opposite directions for articulation, or lock them and steer front. Now you would have possibly lost your rear steering, but they could have had another valve in there for that and had it all simply hydraulic. But they didn't think that far ahead. Worse yet, they went to electronic steer later, and that even got more bizarre. If they'd have kept it simple, stupid, which is one of the things that Case used to have in their training, was KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. And that's the long and short of what caused the failure of that tractor. More than any other part of it. The engine was freewheeling in there, so it didn't have any frame stresses on it like a normal Case tractor did. The transmission was back here in a power shift inside a big old housing. Had plenty of oil in it. Standard drive shafts going out, but they only needed one articulating axle or pivoting axle. That's it. So the drive shaft didn't have to do anything. So how often is that going to fail? Front or rear? It's not. And overall was an excellent design where the tractor was short, so its steering was phenomenal. It could almost come back around on itself. I just sit here with the possibilities of just having a simple control to turn the hydraulic valves to run the slave hydraulic setup for it. I come up with the idea because Ingersoll Rand had an all-terrain forklift, that's what they had. You could actually independently steer the rear axle and had an indicator as to where the axle was. It was stupidly simple. So they could have had the same electronic indicators on those Case tractors to indicate where the rear axle was. That wouldn't affect the hydraulics themselves. So if the indicator caused a problem, just look back to see where your axle is, steer it to where you want it, and go. They missed so many simple things. It would have been a phenomenal tractor. Now, Ford went out and got the County Series from England that was just plain front steer. And both of them were rigid frame, and both had the reputation of being the lightest tractor that could pull the most loads that you just couldn't imagine. I watched a guy that had a 70 or 80 horse County tractor. It was a 5000 Ford Reborn. And they juiced the power up a little bit to handle the four-wheel drive. Didn't steer very well because of the drive shafts and gearboxes that were all over. But he had a 70-horse tractor with a 2-row chopper because his 100 and 130-horse Internationals couldn't chop corn and pull the load. And that's how good these tractors were. But the failures came in their drive system, the steering systems in both cases. Sad world. The simple things get you bit.